Judge Prescott thought he could quiet Pam Bondi with a simple penalty. He never saw it coming. She was about to unravel his whole stance right there in front of everyone. The Tampa, Florida courthouse had hosted plenty of legal showdowns, but that morning, nobody could have guessed the whirlwind about to hit. Pam Bondi, sharp as a tack, strode through the big wooden doors, briefcase swinging in one hand, the other fixing her blazer's lapel. She was there for what should have been an easy hearing, something she could handle with her eyes closed. As she headed to the defendant's table, she caught Judge Alan Prescott's stare before he even opened his mouth. Judge Prescott, a guy famous for his no-fooling-around vibe, wasn't looking at her face. He was zeroed in on something just below her collar, a small gold cross. The room's vibe shifted, a hush settling in. Then, with a voice like a hammer dropping, Prescott cleared his throat and leaned in. "Miss Bondi, I gotta remind you, religious stuff doesn't fly in my courtroom." Pam didn't even twitch. "Your Honor, you're saying my cross breaks the room's neutrality. If that's the case, you'll need to take it off me yourself or slap me with a fine." A little buzz hummed through the handful of folks watching. The bailiff squirmed in his boots, and the clerk shot a quick look from the judge to Pam. This wasn't the first time a judge tried to flex some odd control over his turf, but it was definitely the first time anyone thought to ding a lawyer over a necklace. Pam stood her ground. "Sorry, Your Honor, but my cross, it's no different from a wedding band or a locket with a kid's picture." Judge Prescott's face didn't budge. "That's not how I roll," he said with a sigh, like he was already bored of the chat. "Take it off, or I'm hitting you with a fine for messing with courtroom vibes." For the first time ever, Pam Bondi got fined, not for slipping up in court, not for breaking some rule, but for a piece of jewelry. The money wasn't the big deal, it was what it stood for. She didn't ditch the cross. Instead, she rested her hands on her briefcase, cool as ice. She wasn't letting this slide. "Your Honor, before we move on, I'd like to put this on the table officially." Judge Prescott raised an eyebrow. "Put it on the table? Sure, go ahead and make your case." Pam didn't miss a beat. "I'm filing an objection and want my point logged for the record." The judge smirked, peeking at the wall clock. "Miss Bondi, you know this hearing's about a business mess, not your personal gripes." Pam didn't budge. "And I know the First Amendment doesn't clock out just because you've got an opinion." That got him. He eased back in his chair, eyes narrowing a bit. The court reporter's hands froze over her keys. The room tensed up, not over some contract fight, but because a pro attorney just called out a judge to his face. Pam knew she was on shaky ground, but backing off, not her style. "You're penalizing me for a cross. Let's dig into that legally, huh?" The judge huffed, rubbing his forehead. But Pam was already fishing in her briefcase. She wasn't just going to talk. She was ready to flip his whole argument upside down. Judge Prescott had no clue how big a mess he'd just stepped into. Pam pulled out a single page, setting it down real careful on the table. She didn't hurry. Every move was on purpose, every quiet second cranking up the room's tension. Judge Prescott sighed again. "Miss Bondi, I'm not here for drama." Pam didn't flinch. "Me neither, Your Honor, but I've got a solid grip on constitutional law." The judge leaned forward, hands clasped like he was gearing up for whatever she'd throw. "You're fining me for a cross, saying it throws off the courtroom's balance. So tell me, Your Honor, what legal backup you got for that?" The place went dead quiet. The reporter's fingers hovered. The bailiff barely moved. Judge Prescott let out a slow breath. "This room runs on my say-so, Miss Bondi." Pam nodded. "Sure does. But your say-so doesn't trump the Constitution." She tapped her paper. "First Amendment says I can express my faith, long as it's not messing up the day's work." The judge snorted. "You're a lawyer, not a teacher." Pam grinned, but it was all steel, no sugar. "Then let's chat case law, okay?" She lifted the page. "Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. Big deal case that says folks don't lose their rights just because they walk into a public building, school, courtroom, whatever." Judge Prescott's jaw tightened just a smidge. He knew that case, every lawyer did. Pam kept going. "West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett, 1943, Pam said, laying it out. "The Supreme Court made it clear, forcing folks to ditch or hide personal belief symbols, that's a straight-up First Amendment no-no." She set the paper down easy. "So, Your Honor, you want me to keep rolling, or you want to rethink that fine?" Judge Prescott's fingers tapped the armrest of his chair. He was stuck, and he knew it, but his ego wasn't ready to wave the white flag just yet. "This isn't some faith debate, Miss Bondi," he shot back. Pam tilted her head. "Then why'd you turn it into one?" A couple soft gasps popped up around the courtroom. Judge Prescott's face got a shade darker. His tone stayed sharp, but his grip on the room was slipping. Pam leaned in, cool and steady. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll chill when you give me a solid legal reason for this fine. 'Cause I ain't heard one yet." A long beat hung in the air. Finally, the judge glanced at the clerk. "Mark the fine as pending review." Pam smirked. "I'll call that a quick win for now." But she wasn't done. The real showdown was just heating up. Judge Prescott's expression didn't crack, but you could tell he was squirming in his seat. He'd banked on her just going along quietly, not hitting him with a full-on constitutional curveball. The room wasn't just tense anymore, it was buzzing. Pam felt every pair of eyes locked on her, waiting to see what had happened next. She'd drawn her line, and now Prescott had two options: stick to his shaky reasoning and risk looking foolish, or figure out a way to back off without losing face. But this judge, he wasn't the type to fold easy. "Miss Bondi," he started, voice all calm and controlled. "Courtroom rules are there for a reason. If I let one personal thing slide, I've got to let them all through." Pam pressed her lips together. "You mean like the wedding rings half the lawyers here are rocking? Or those lapel pins you're cool with on government folks?" Prescott's jaw got tight. Pam kept it rolling. "Or how about that time you let a defense attorney sport a pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness mid-trial? That didn't bug you?" A few quiet whispers floated through the crowd. Prescott threw a hard look their way, but it was too late. Pam had just called out his pick-and-choose game. She leaned back, arms crossed. "So, Your Honor, why's this rule only hitting my cross?" Prescott's fingers gripped the edge of his desk. He was boxed in and everybody could see it. He'd pulled out some unwritten rule based on his own take, and now it was falling apart. For the first time that day, he didn't have a comeback. Pam didn't rub it in. She just let the quiet stretch, long enough for the room to soak it all in. Then she dropped the big one. "If you're sticking with this fine, Your Honor, I'll have an appeal filed before the day's out. And trust me, this'll be all over the news." She paused, letting it hit. A judge fining a woman for a cross in court? Oh, I bet the higher-ups would have a field day with that one. Prescott's nostrils flared. His pride was duking it out with the cold facts. Pam held his gaze, letting him stew. The longer he waited, the clearer his slip-up got. After what felt like forever, he let out a sharp breath. "Fine's off the table," he grumbled. Pam flashed a small smile. "Thanks, Your Honor." But this wasn't just about the fine anymore. She'd made a point he wouldn't shake off easy. His words, "Fine's off the table," should have wrapped it up. But the courtroom wasn't just a legal spot now. It was a show. Everyone there had just seen something unforgettable. The court reporter kept her eyes on her keys, but she knew this was going to spread fast. The clerk, who'd looked antsy when the fine first dropped, snuck a quick peek at Pam, almost like he was impressed. Judge Prescott shuffled his papers, sitting up straight like he could wipe the moment away. But Pam wasn't fooled. This wasn't something he could shrug off. The silence was loud. Pam smoothed out her blazer, that little gold cross still sitting right where it had been all along. She'd come out on top, but she wasn't stopping there. This win had to count for more. She glanced at her client, a middle-aged business owner who'd been the real reason for the hearing. He gave her a small nod, respect shining through. He was even more sold on her now. Pam got it. This wasn't just her fight anymore. Outside the courthouse, word spread quick. A reporter who'd been sniffing around a different case in the building caught the scoop on what just went down. Within an hour, a local news site dropped a headline. "Florida judge tries to fine lawyer over a cross. It backfires big time." Pam's phone started lighting up. Buzz after buzz from colleagues, old law school buddies, even reporters. Everyone wanted the scoop on what went down. But Pam wasn't chasing the spotlight or caring about how the media spun it. She had her eyes on something bigger, taking this beyond just a one-off courtroom clash. She wasn't clueless. She knew stuff like this sent waves, whether she meant it to or not. This wasn't about one judge and one lawyer anymore. It was a shot at a rule that hadn't been locked in yet, but could be soon. Would other judges pull the same move? Would lawyers start feeling like they had to leave their personal stuff at home to dodge a fight? Could this spark others to test courtroom rules in ways that messed with people's beliefs? Pam wasn't about to let that slide. By that night, the story had legs of its own. A big-name legal talking head on a conservative news channel brought it up during a panel. Social media went wild, folks arguing over whether the judge was right or Pam's pushback was a clutch move for constitutional rights. Pam kicked back in her office, scrolling through the chatter on her phone. A producer from a national news network had already hit her up for an interview. She let out a slow breath, rubbing her temple. She'd spent years battling for clients, holding her own in tough cases. But this hit different. It wasn't about business deals or defending someone. It was about personal freedom and whether a judge could just yank it away on a whim. But she had a gut feeling Judge Prescott wasn't done with her yet. Even as she'd walked out of the courthouse that day, the way he'd stared her down before slamming the gavel and ending the session. He'd dropped the fine, sure, but something in his look said this wasn't over. Pam figured there'd be some noise, maybe a few emails or calls from lawyer pals chiming in. What she didn't see coming was how fast it all blew up. Next morning, she strolled into her office, and her assistant Lauren was already there, looking worried. "You gotta check this out," she said, holding up her tablet. Pam grabbed it, skimming the screen. The Florida Bar Association had put out a statement, carefully worded, neutral sounding, but the vibe was clear. Judges can keep order in their rooms, and while lawyers get some personal say, they need to play by the presiding judge's rules. We trust the system to handle this fairly. Pam exhaled slow. This wasn't just a random note, it was a heads up. The phrase "play by the presiding judge's rules" wasn't casual, it was a nudge. The legal crowd was tight, and the Florida bar didn't usually weigh in on courtroom spats unless they thought things were spiraling. This meant Prescott wasn't just salty, he was pulling strings behind the scenes to get some backup. She set the tablet down. "This dropped today?" Lauren nodded. "Like an hour ago." Pam wasn't shocked. The legal world was small, gossip flew fast, and Prescott wasn't letting this go quietly. Before she could say more, Lauren paused. "There's something else," she said, voice careful. Pam looked up, face blank. "Hit me." Lauren handed over a printed page. Pam scanned the top lines, her pulse steady but her brain kicking into gear. Attorney Pamela Bondi acted in a way that threw off courtroom flow, questioned judicial authority without cause, and pulled moves unfit for a court officer. Pam couldn't hold it in. She let out a quick, dry laugh. "Unfit? That's a good one," Lauren sighed. "It's straight-up payback, no question." Pam leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping the armrest. Prescott wasn't just after revenge. He was trying to make her a cautionary tale. He'd lost on his own turf, and now he was flipping the script, using the system to flex. With this official complaint, he wasn't the judge who'd overreached anymore. He was framing himself as the guy who'd been dissed. And Pam? He wanted her to look like some hotshot lawyer stirring trouble just for kicks. She'd seen this play before. It was a classic move. Flip the script, make the one pointing fingers look like the troublemaker, and bury the real issue under a pile of red tape. But Pam wasn't about to let that fly. "What's the next step here?" she asked, already switching gears. Lauren let out a breath. "You've got 10 days to reply. If they push it, they'll set up a full review." Pam gave a slow nod. "And who's running that review?" Lauren paused. "A group of judges and top lawyers." Pam almost cracked a grin. If Prescott thought he'd drown her in forms and hush-hush pressure, he'd misread her big time. This wasn't staying low-key. It was about to blow up. Lauren watched her, waiting for the plan. Pam took a deep breath and grabbed her phone. If Prescott wants to mess around, let's mess back. She scrolled her contacts, her brain already racing ahead. He figured she'd just sit through some quiet hearing, take a slap on the wrist, and call it a day. But he didn't get who he was up against. Pam had been playing smart for years, and now she was going to make sure all eyes were on this. She didn't waste a second. She knew how these things went down. Retaliation worked best in the dark, and Prescott was banking on keeping it there, using the system to trip her up while no one noticed. Not on her watch. She found the number she wanted and hit call. After 2 rings, a familiar voice picked up. "Pam, I was just about to ring you." It was Lisa Reynolds, a seasoned reporter from a big legal news show. She'd covered Pam's heavy-hitting cases before and wasn't shy about digging into judges stepping out of line. Pam cut right to it. "Lisa, listen up. A judge just slapped a formal complaint on me for messing up his courtroom. Truth is, he tried to fine me for wearing my cross. I pushed back and he caved. Now he's using the system to get even." Lisa went quiet for a sec, then let out a quick huff. You're saying a judge is coming after you because you called him out on overstepping? Pam grinned. That's the deal. Lisa didn't blink. I'm running this, Pam. Full steam. She leaned in. I need it out there before they twist it into some quiet wrist slap. Lisa was already moving. I'll have it up by tomorrow with legal pros breaking it down, ones who won't hold back on what this really is. Pam hung up, feeling the tide starting to turn her way, but she wasn't stopping there. She spun back to Lauren, put together a public statement. I want to lay it out clear before Prescott and his crew can blur the lines. Lauren nodded. You want it pegged as judicial overreach? Pam smirked. I want it pegged as what it is, an attack on rights and a judge throwing his weight around wrong. If he thinks he can ding me for standing my ground, think about what he's done to folks without a voice, Pam added. Lauren's face got serious. I'm on it. Pam breathed out, pulling her thoughts together. Prescott had bet on her staying quiet, but now the whole country was about to see what he'd pulled. She didn't have to wait long. By the next morning, sipping her coffee, her phone was going off like crazy. Lisa's segment had hit overnight and social media was lit up. The headline was everywhere. Florida judge tries to punish lawyer over across. Now he's feeling the heat. It wasn't just the usual outlets. Legal voices from all sides were jumping in. A constitutional lawyer from Georgetown went live, shredding Prescott's reasoning as a total overstep with no legs to stand on. Another big-name attorney dropped a post breaking down how Pam had spotlighted a risky trend that needed fixing. Then came the news she'd been waiting for. The Florida Judicial Review Board said, with all the buzz, they'd be looking into Prescott's actions to see if he'd crossed ethical lines. Pam leaned back in her chair, letting out a breath. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was about every lawyer, every client, every person stepping into a courtroom, wondering if their rights could get tossed out with a judge's say-so. Lauren popped in, holding up her phone. You'll want to check this. Pam took it and hit play. There was Prescott standing outside the courthouse. Cameras were flashing like crazy around Judge Prescott, lighting up the courthouse steps. His face was stiff, like he'd rehearsed this moment but couldn't quite sell it. His statement came out fast, too fast for someone trying to dig himself out of a hole. I've always kept the integrity of this courtroom solid, he said, voice flat. The steps I took were all about keeping things neutral and fair. That said, I respect the judicial review process, and I'll work with it fully. Pam almost let out a laugh right there. Neutrality? He was still leaning on that excuse, even after everything? She shook her head, watching the clip on Lauren's phone. The guy was grasping at straws, and it was obvious. Lauren crossed her arms, leaning against Pam's desk. He's just trying to save face, you know that, right? Pam nodded, sipping her coffee slow. Oh, for sure. And he's bombing at it. This mess isn't going anywhere. The Judicial Review Board had a big choice ahead. If they ruled against Prescott, it wouldn't just be a little oops on his record. It'd be a full-on professional gut punch. More than that, it'd lay down a line in the sand, a precedent that'd protect people like Pam from getting hit with this kind of comeback ever again. She pictured it. Lawyers walking into courtrooms across Florida, knowing they wouldn't have to deal with some judge's random power trip over a necklace or a pin. That kind of win, it'd echo. But even if the board didn't drop the hammer on him, Prescott was already cooked where it really stung. His reputation, done. His credibility, shot. His whole I'm in charge vibe, out the window. After this, every attorney who stepped into his courtroom would have the story in their back pocket. This was the judge who tried to hush someone up over a cross and got handed a loss in front of everybody. Pam could see it now. The whispers in the halls, the quick glances from lawyers who'd never forget how he'd fumbled. That kind of damage didn't wash off with a press statement or a stiff upper lip. She took another sip of her coffee, letting the warmth settle in as she replayed the whole thing in her head. It had started so small, just a routine day, a quick hearing, and that little gold cross she'd worn forever. Then Prescott had to make it a thing, and now here they were, with the whole country watching. She glanced up at Lauren, who was still smirking at the clip. We won this one, Pam said, setting her mug down with a soft clink. Lauren's grin widened. Oh, I know. He didn't see you coming, that's for sure. Pam leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of it sink in. She hadn't just fought for herself in that room. She'd thrown up a signal flare for anybody who'd ever felt a judge's gavel try to nudge their rights out the door. It wasn't about the fine anymore, or even the cross, really. It was about that bigger truth. You don't let someone in power take what's yours without pushing back. Sometimes all it takes is one person digging in their heels to shift the whole picture. She'd seen it before in her career, little moments that snowballed into something real. But this one felt different. This one had teeth. She thought about the folks who'd been in her shoes, maybe not with a cross, but with something else. A ring, a ribbon, a quiet piece of who they were that some judge didn't like. How many had just nodded and taken it off, figuring it wasn't worth the hassle? How many had walked out of a courtroom feeling smaller than when they'd walked in? That's what kept her going. If she could make sure one less person had to shrink down like that, it'd be worth every second of this circus. Prescott probably thought he'd scare her into line, but he'd picked the wrong target. She'd spent years building her backbone, and she wasn't about to bend now. The buzz from her phone pulled her out of her thoughts. More notifications, more people jumping in online. Lisa's segment had done its job, and the story was spreading like wildfire. Legal analysts were still tearing into it, and social media was a mess of hot takes. Pam scrolled through a few, catching snippets of support from strangers who got it. People saying stuff like, "This is why we need folks like her in the system," and "Judges don't get to play king just because they've got a robe." It wasn't just noise, it was proof this had hit a nerve. "If you're all about standing up for what's yours, don't sit quiet," she said out loud, half to Lauren, half to herself. "Make sure people hear you. Like, comment, subscribe. Stick around for more real stories that actually mean something." Lauren chuckled. "You're sounding like a pro at this already." Pam shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Hey, if they're gonna watch, might as well give them something worth hearing."
This is an artistic and fictional creation intended for both entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual people or events is purely coincidental. Some scenes and dialogues in the video are part of a dramatized performance and incorporate elements of grotesque, satire, and exaggeration. The creator stands against discrimination, violence, and hatred. This channel fully complies with YouTube's policies and does not infringe upon copyright laws.